Ladies and gentlemen, you are watching a very special Christmas edition of the Cashing Points live stream. I'm your host this evening, Scott Barrett, joined by the great Jake Tribbey. Jake, what's going on? How you doing?
Not much. I'm doing good. It's quite exciting, having football over the holidays. It's a great weekend for DFS, and I know a lot of people are traveling, probably won't have time to do their normal research, but we're taking care of that for you here at Fantasy Points.
Yeah, that's our edge. I'm neglecting my children. They're not getting any presents. I tell them Christmas is February 28th. That's when we celebrate, because I need to be grinding DFS so our subscribers can win lots of money. I haven't left my house in 4 months. That's what we do here.
It is. Yeah. We're in the home stretch. So this is where we really magnify our edge. We've got tons of great data, tons of good stuff to work with, and a bunch of great games on Christmas. It's a wonderful time here.
Yeah. Our competition, they're spending time with their family. They're drinking eggnog. Nope. That's not what we do. No, we grind and we grind and we grind. And occasionally we'll win $25,000. Shout out me. Shout out to me. All right, Jake, let's dive into this. We'll walk the slate like we normally do. I've done very minimal research, so really trust Jake and his analysis. Really, really sharp guy, this Jake Tribbey. Jake, Raiders, Chiefs. Who's favored in this game? Is it Aiden O'Connell or is it the defending Super Bowl champions?
Yeah, I believe it's the Chiefs. Kadarius Toney being ruled out probably raised the spread from 10 to like 25. That's a huge edge there. But yeah, I believe
it's an injury.
Yeah. He's been I don't know exactly what it was, but he's been dealing with something for a while. I mean, he's made of glass, man. The guy's always hurt.
Yeah.
I called him. I was excited to talk about him today because I called him Looney Tunes Deontay Johnson in my article. Instead he gets ruled out. But so starting off on the Chiefs side, I mean, Mahomes and Lamar. Quarterback pricing is interesting on this site. Mahomes, Lamar, Jalen Hurts, all pretty tight in price. Jalen Hurts going to be mega chalk this week. Patrick Mahomes profiling as a decent play, but of course, the problem with Mahomes is that he just hasn't shown the fantasy upside that we've seen in previous seasons. He has as many games of 22 or more DraftKings points as Desmond Ridder, and last year he had 13 such games. So really falling off in that regard. They're playing slower, they're scoring less. They do seem to be running a bit more in the red zone. At the same time, it is Patrick Mahomes, and he's not going to be the highest owned quarterback of the slate. So that's really the argument for him in GPPs. Again, I do think quarterback is pretty tough. I don't have a ton of conviction on these guys beyond what consensus is at, but I'm curious, Scott, if you have any strong takes here on Mahomes before we get to these playmakers for Kansas City.
Yeah, again, I haven't done any research, but I don't think I'd be too eager to play Mahomes. 10.5 point spread. Looks to me like a Pacheco game.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, with McKinnon ruled out, Isaiah Pacheco is looking like one of the best plays of the slate. I think he's pretty much right there as the best play on the slate. There's a very clear top tier to me in CMC, Pacheco, and Rashee Rice, who we will talk about shortly, but they're all fantastic values, all killer plays. Without Jerick McKinnon, Pacheco averaged 22.8 expected fantasy points per game and 25.1 fantasy points per game in those two games without McKinnon. Those are Christian McCaffrey numbers, and he is significantly cheaper than McCaffrey. Again, McKinnon has been ruled out for this game. So I do have Pacheco ranked as the best running back play of the slate. I think, you could argue it's splitting hairs between him and McCaffrey, but yeah, a really, really, really fantastic spot for Isaiah Pacheco. Scott, with no Kadarius Toney, who does the ball even go to? Who do the Chiefs even throw to with no Toney? I mean, he's the greatest player of all time. He might be the ultimate Ponzi scheme. You're like the Bernie Madoff of the Kadarius Toney fan club. So, who are the Chiefs going to throw to?
Well, it has to be Rashee Rice, right? Who's just he's looking like a top 2023 league winner, has led the team in targets and 4 straight games. He's now finally seeing that full-time workload. Kelsey, I don't want to call him dusty, but he's kind of dusty and, might retire when the season ends. He's sort of hinted at that, but clearly looks like the number one receiver on this team. Also high amount of manufactured touches, such as screens, design targets. So wide receiver 6 of the slate. I don't know. Looks like a great play to me.
Yeah, to me, he is easily the best wide receiver play on the slate. AJ Brown pretty clearly in his own tier as number 2. Rashee Rice's volume is just absurd. I think Kadarius Toney being ruled out is probably a bit of a boost for him, considering his designed targets. Last 5 weeks, 63% of Kansas City's designed targets. Travis Kelce's only at 16%. And it really can't be understated how valuable that is when Kansas City runs so many of those, shovel passes, pop passes, weird screens right at the goal line. So his touchdown equity is probably a lot better than Vegas is implying right now.
Yeah, no McKinnon either. He sometimes gets those.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, Rashee Rice is everything you're looking for in a DFS play. I don't think, I'm looking around the industry. I'm seeing 40% ownership. That's just way too low to me. Cash game must play. And again, I mean, we really just can't overstate how strong of a play Rashee Rice is at wide receiver this week. Matchups also very strong. Raiders have been quite weak to outside wide receivers over the last 5 weeks on a schedule adjusted basis. Beyond Rashee Rice, Justin Watson and MVS are pretty much the same guy to me. I think I prefer Justin Watson slightly more because he can actually catch, but it's a pure punt between those two. You're probably mostly only mixing those guys into Patrick Mahomes lineups. I do think, though, that Richie James is quite interesting at the Stone minimum. Again, we mentioned Kadarius Toney has been ruled out. Sky Moore is on IR. So who's going to get those, those kind of those scheme slot designed throws that the Chiefs are normally good for, 4, 5, 6 targets a game? Looks like it's going to be Richie James. And what was interesting was, I started writing up this slate on Wednesday. Kadarius Toney was popping as a pretty decent value. And I basically just see Richie James stepping into that exact role, and he doesn't seem to be projecting quite as well. Maybe sites were giving Toney the Looney Tunes bonus for the, the fumbles and the interceptions he causes. But yeah, Scott, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on Richie James as a potential punt here.
Yeah, I don't know. He has 4 catches all year.
Yeah, that's the tough part. But they really don't have anyone else to man the slot.
Yeah. Sky Moore. You never know with Andy Reid.
Sky Moore's on IR.
Oh,
but
right.
Yeah, you do.
Damn, I guess you're right. That is no one else.
Yeah. So, he might only see a 40% route share. He might only get 3 or 4 targets, but, at 3,000 on this slate where Wan'Dale Robinson's projecting for 40% ownership, I like it in GPPs. I think it's probably a more viable punt than projections are giving it credit for right now.
Well, what about your boy Travis Kelce? Definitely doesn't look like a value. If I make 3 lineups, I don't really think he's necessary, but like typically on a 3-game slate, right, you would need Kelce exposure. But it's been a rough down streak for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, his volume's fallen by about 13% since we've seen Rashee Rice emerge. The matchup is fairly neutral. And again, we have seen Rice just dominate those design targets. He has averaged more expected touchdowns per game than Kelce over the last 3 games. Kelce's target share or first read target share has also fallen to 24%, which is 40th among all pass catchers over the last 3 weeks. But yeah, of course, this is Travis Kelce, and this is a slate where I think everyone's going to be bending over backwards to try to pay up for Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, AJ Brown. So Kelce won't draw a ton of ownership. We know he still has plenty of upside. He, obviously hasn't shown a ton of that this year. And yeah, I think it's totally fine to play both Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce in a lineup without Mahomes, but I would, that's not something I would want to do a whole lot of. Yeah, I think really he's just like a solid contrarian play. And I don't, have a ton of conviction on him overall here.
Well, what about Raiders side? I know you're not a wide receiver versus CB truther like I am, but I do worry about L'Jarius Sneed shadowing Devontae Adams. Theoretically should be a softer matchup for Jacoby Myers, maybe Austin Hooper in play without Michael Mayer? You tell me.
Yeah, so the Raiders side is pretty interesting here. Aiden O'Connell is going to go, massively overlooked, and I think you could argue that that's justifiable because he's Aiden O'Connell, and outside of their thrashing of the Chargers, where Los Angeles had just completely given up, O'Connell really hasn't done much all year. The on-paper matchup is bottom 8. Like I said, hasn't scored more than 14 DraftKings points in a game this season, excluding that game against Los Angeles. At the same time, though, I mean, that was O'Connell's best game of the year by both DraftKings points and PFF passing grade. And interestingly, he does have the best schematic matchup on the slate against Kansas City. He also posted an 84 PFF passing grade the last time he played the Chiefs, which was easily his second best passing grade of the season after that game against the Chargers. So, when you're punting quarterback on this slate, we got a lot of good quarterbacks here. But if you're punting quarterback, you're only looking at Aiden O'Connell and Tommy DeVito. Obviously, Tommy DeVito is going to pull in about 3 times more ownership. I'm imagining DeVito around 15%, O'Connell around 5%. I actually do think O'Connell is viable, especially in larger field stuff. If you're just thinking that the Raiders can show up here, you can pair him with Josh Jacobs, who I think is a pretty strong play. We'll talk about him in a minute, but they do have a very strong correlation, plus 0.54 between the duo. So yeah, if you think the Raiders show up here, I do think like an O'Connell, Josh Jacobs plus a receiver stack is plenty viable. And, the receivers, we'll talk about them before we get to Jacobs, who I actually like quite a bit. But yeah, Davante Adams really struggled the last time these teams played. It was his worst volume game in a contest with Aiden O'Connell. What was interesting was that this was also the only game that O'Connell has started where Jacoby Myers matched or exceeded Davante Adams in total targets. Jacoby Myers scored 20.1 DraftKings points last time they played Kansas City. You look schedule adjusted, I believe schematic as well. This is a slightly better spot for Jacoby Myers, who's going largely overlooked when you look at projections and stuff. So, you could argue O'Connell, Josh Jacobs, Jacoby Myers, pretty sneaky stack, but far and away, the best value among these Raiders pass catchers is Austin Hooper. Michael Mayer ruled out with a toe injury. Hooper's just 2,500. And if you look at the last few weeks since Antonio Pierce took over as the interim head coach, Michael Mayer's TD equity actually quite strong. His first read target share, 29% inside the red zone. That's behind only Davante Adams. And Kansas City is the 5th softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing tight ends since week 10. So this is a really good spot for Austin Hooper. You just got to hope the team treats him the same as they had been treating Michael Mayer, which is really is a red zone priority these last few weeks. He's only 2,500 though, so he might only need 3 or 4 catches to really get you there. He's going to be right there, I think, with Isaiah Likely as the best tight end value of the slate. Not everything is updated industry wide, and I still need to update my rankings because that news came out 2 minutes before we started the show. But yeah, Austin Hooper looking like a very, very strong value. So I think, yeah, you could argue, if you're making an O'Connell stack, I definitely prefer Hooper, Jacoby Myers as my top options. Could always argue for Davante Adams. Easy to see 10 or 12 targets here. But, like you mentioned, Scott, the matchup is really tough, does favor Hooper and Jacoby Myers. And then, yeah, there's Josh Jacobs, who dropped 25 DraftKings points the last time these teams played, despite it being a 14-point loss. I mean, he's the center of this offense. Antonio Pierce wants to get him that 3-point bonus on DraftKings every time he sees the field. He thinks that's, a major key to Las Vegas winning games. And yeah, I mean, he does have the same concerns as he always does in a game where the Raiders are huge underdogs, which is him just getting totally game scripted out. But at the same time, I think they're just determined to feed him. So if you were making a Chiefs lineup and you had to use one run back after Austin Hooper, Josh Jacobs would probably be my second favorite. But yeah, it's also easy to argue against all these Raiders guys, behind the idea that they don't show up. But, on a 3-game slate, anything goes. And like I said, I mean, I think Raiders onslaughts, Jacoby Myers, even Aiden O'Connell are pretty viable in tournaments.
Yeah, I'm going to veto Josh Jacobs. Raiders went up 14-0. He had a 60-yard run that accounted for more than half of his yards from scrimmage, I'm pretty sure. So game script sensitive. I think Chiefs defense just shuts him down and he gets scripted out. But I like everything else he said. Isaiah Pacheco, awesome play. Rashee Rice, awesome play. Austin Hooper, awesome play. Richie James, YOLO contrarian. I dig it. Moving on to the next game, Giants, Eagles. And the craziest thing about this game is that the Giants are going to win it. Jake, your thoughts?
Yeah, that is quite a take, Scott. You should figure out a way to lay some American dollars on this.
Let's go, Big Blue. Let's go.
But yeah, I mean, I think, the first guy we have to talk about here is obviously Jalen Hurts, who, appears finally healthy. He's exceeded double-digit rush attempts in 4 of his last 6 games. He's scoring rushing TDs at an insane rate. It's basically an auto score as soon as they get inside the 2-yard line for Jalen Hurts. He's projecting really well on this slate. And I think the matchup is really strong. This Giants defense blitzes at a top 4 rate. They also play man coverage at a top 4 rate. Hurts has been a top 3 quarterback by fantasy points per dropback against the blitz. And, he's been okay against man coverage, but A.J. Brown has absolutely cooked man coverage all season. I guess that leads nicely into the A.J. Brown discussion, because to me, he's very clearly the second best wide receiver play on the slate. Rashee Rice is kind of on his own in tier 1, and then A.J. Brown in tier 2. Just with the way the Giants play defense, I think he's going to get a lot of one-on-one coverage. And, you could argue the Eagles offense hasn't been as creative as it has been in years past, probably because they lost their offensive coordinator this past year. But man, I mean, when they get man-on-man on the outside, they're tossing it up to A.J. Brown, and he has just been absolutely dominant against the blitz and man coverage. His first read target share jumps by about 10%. He's also the 4th most productive wide receiver against man coverage on a fantasy points per route run basis, and the 8th most productive wide receiver on a yards per route run basis. This is just a very, very strong spot for A.J. Brown, and you're not paying quite as much as you would for him on a normal slate because they tend to condense pricing here. Scott, any other thoughts on AJ Brown?
Yeah, Devonta Smith misses. What does that do to Brown? What does that do to Goddard? What does that do to Julio Jones? I don't know.
Yeah, so I really think it's the biggest boost for Goddard if Devonta Smith ends up missing, followed by a boost to AJ Brown. I mean, none of these ancillary guys, Quez Watkins, Julio Jones or Olamide Zaccheaus, are seeing like really any usage at all. They would all see, some bumps within industry projections, but man, they all feel like a trap to me, especially with Richie James on this slate. I mean, even with the Devonta Smith out, I mean, it's hard to argue any of these guys would be strong plays. So I think, we've seen before when Goddard is out, it's a pretty significant bump to Smith's target share. I think the exact opposite would be true if Smith ends up missing. For what it's worth, Devonta Smith did return to practice today. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Still not sure if he will play. But yeah, like I said, that would make Dallas Goedert a very strong tight end play, further bump A.J. Brown. And I don't think you can mess with any of these ancillary guys. Assuming Devonta Smith does play, though, he's really just a mediocre play to me. Doesn't really stand out in regards to this matchup. I think, blitz-heavy, man-heavy defense just really favors A.J. Brown. And I feel similarly about Dallas Goedert, who, is more than fine in Jalen Hurts stacks, but really doesn't stand out on his own as a one-off play. I think, especially if you're playing large field tournaments and you're not playing Jalen Hurts, you can get a little more creative or just chase value with your tight end plays.
That makes sense. What about on the Giants side?
Yeah, so we got Tommy DeVito starting another game. He's only 5,000. So, looking through consensus projections, he's actually projecting as a pretty decent value. Obviously Hurts clearly the quarterback 1, but DeVito's QB2, QB3, depending on what projection set you look at. He's running quite a bit, and this is like the ultimate matchup. The Eagles are the league's top pass funnel and the 3rd softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing quarterbacks. So you look at all these quarterbacks on this slate, Tommy DeVito has by far the best matchup. Mac Jones and Sam Howell both scored over 28 DraftKings points against the Eagles defense. DeVito can run. He's gone over 35 rushing yards in 3 of his 5 games this season. That said, he's going to be 15% owned. I do slightly prefer Aiden O'Connell in larger field GPPs, but if you want to play DeVito, I get it. I do think if you're playing DeVito, you are kind of banking on the Giants showing up a bit more than Vegas is implying. They have the lowest total on the slate, implied team total, I believe at 14.75. Pretty brutal there. And one of the more interesting things that I found when I was researching this slate is that Tommy DeVito and Saquon Barkley have a 0.94 positive correlation together. So I really like the idea, if you're playing DeVito, stack him with Barkley, and then you can pair him with either one of these value wide receivers or Darren Waller, and you can maybe throw in the Giants defense as well, with the hopes that, the Eagles offense, they were incredible last year, but this year they've shown plenty of warts. I've seen on some of the more analytical football podcasts that aren't fantasy related, a lot of people have said they're kind of just recycling their greatest hits, and that this is an easier offense to stop than it was in 2022. So there could be a little bit more juice than, what projections imply, or what, intuition might imply to some of these Giants onslaught stacks, which I think are pretty interesting in larger tournaments. But yeah, Scott, you're the Giants guy. So any extra thoughts there?
Yeah, not really. I kind of would want to just full fade Giant side. I think,
but they're going to win.
I was just messing around. Well, yeah, nuts matchup for the Giants perimeter wide receivers, but I don't trust Hyatt. I don't trust Slayton. I have no interest in Wan'Dale Robinson, especially with Darren Waller back. Waller too is a pretty thin play. 40% route share last week. I would feel comfortable just full fading a lot of them. Even with Barkley, it's like, okay, touch expectation or market share is high, but their implied point total is what? 11 points?
14.75.
Yeah, that's brutal.
Yeah, no, it is. It is quite bad. And that's kind of why I said I think Giants onslaught stacks may be the way to go here, because they need to show up. And, if they can actually manage it, then that could certainly be viable. If you're stacking the Eagles quarterback and wide receiver and you don't want to bring it back with Waller, I would say that your most viable options are Jalen Hyatt and Darius Slayton. Wan'Dale Robinson is projecting as chalk. He obviously has a great floor because he gets all these targets that are like 2 yards down the field, but the ceiling in tournaments, I mean, we really just haven't seen it out of Wan'Dale. If you faded Wan'Dale every week he was chalk, I think you'd be up a bunch of money this year. So yeah, really don't get the Wan'Dale love. Slayton projects slightly better than Jalen Hyatt. So, in a vacuum, he would be my preference, but they're both just total dart throws. You're hoping that they can catch a deep ball in, what is a very, very strong matchup. But, of course, Tommy DeVito is throwing them the ball. Vegas really has no confidence here. I do think I like Darren Waller a bit more than Scott implied. 40% route share last week, but they were just easing him in. I mean, if he can get back to the 78% route share that he earned in his healthy games, you could argue he's a pretty sneaky tournament play at tight end. But this is a slate where we have really, really strong tight end values in Austin Hooper and Isaiah Likely. So, you could also say you just don't have to get cute, and that Waller's not really in play. Again, probably a guy I'd be looking more at, as a run back in Eagle stacks, but even more so in those Giants onslaught stacks, which I don't want to make it seem like I'm playing a ton of those, but if you're making 10 lineups, maybe one Giants onslaught makes a little bit of sense.
Jake, assuming you have enough salary left over to where it doesn't matter, you can only play one, would you go with AJ Brown or Boston Scott?
Well, Boston Scott, if you look, at Vegas, Boston Scott has a very high likelihood of scoring a touchdown because I guess everyone is making that bet.
Renowned who has maybe 3 touches all year.
Yeah. He's apparently like 55% of his red zone touches in his entire career have come against the New York Giants. So that's something.
What if he just really hates New Jersey like me? Just plays with extra motivation to get that touchdown.
You see, those are the unquantifiable things that we just can't capture. Maybe fantasy points data can add the motivation matrix in the future here. Final note on this game. We should,
the running back, is DeAndre Swift in play?
Yeah, DeAndre Swift is in play, but it does scare me. I was hoping McKinnon would play because then we could have gotten some really great leverage on Pacheco. Pacheco's going to be the most popular right there with McCaffrey. DeAndre Swift will be the RB3 in terms of ownership. He's projecting quite well. I do think you can poke plenty of holes in Swift, though. Kenny Gainwell has been playing more. His TD equity really isn't that strong given the brotherly shove, auto touchdown for Jalen Hurts inside the 2. Gainwell's also stolen about 35% of backfield usage inside of the red zone over these last few weeks. So yeah, DeAndre Swift is fine. I think he's going to go over-owned on this slate. Yeah, not a guy that I really love. I prefer a lot of these other running backs. But yeah, I mean, he's fine. The Eagles could totally steamroll, and it's easy to see him going for over 100 and a score in that scenario. But yeah, not quite as strong of a play as median projections would imply. Kenny Gainwell also, if you need like a total punt at running back, but I think there's enough value on this slate that you don't need to go there.
All right, can we move on to the next game?
Sure.
All right. We might see this game again in the Super Bowl. Ravens, 49ers. 49ers favored to win by a surprisingly large amount. What is it? 6?
Yeah, I've seen 5.5 for the most part. So yeah, pretty big spread here. I mean, you could argue Baltimore's the second best team in the league, and San Francisco is still a very large favorite because they've just looked unstoppable.
I mean, Ravens look just as good by a number of metrics. You want to talk about point differential versus strength of opponent. They're right there. Purdy, the MVP favorite, but Lamar number 2, and maybe that jumps with a win here. Who knows? But yeah, I guess we could start with Baltimore's side, which is definitely the less exciting to me. Zay Flowers, I just hate his guts. I was super low on him coming out, and I've seen nothing to kind of back me off of that. Just a ton of screens, sub 5 ADOT catches, and like really nothing else beyond that. No, he had that 2 touchdown game, but just no yards. OBJ is like super efficient on a per route basis, but limited route share. Bateman, I don't really have any interest in. And so, like you said, likely is one of the top values. I get that. He's definitely looked like the number 1 target the last few weeks. Also, Andrews was the team's zone beater, and now defenses are playing a ton of zone. So you think that maybe likely slides into that zone beater role. What are your thoughts, Jake?
Yeah, I think those are all pretty good calls, really line up with what I was thinking here. I mean, Zay Flowers, I think Wandale, you look at the chalk wide receivers, Wandale's the easiest to fade. Zay Flowers, pretty clear number 2. He has worse usage than Odell Beckham and Isaiah Likely over the last 2 games. He has just 2 more targets than Rashad Bateman over that stretch. Flowers' yards per route run since Mark Andrews went down is just 0.79. That's worse than Nelson Aguilar. But, he is the only Ravens wide receiver with a route share over 60%. He's playing on every snap, 98% since week 12. And his role, to be fair, is a bit more downfield than Scott just gave him credit for. 9.6 ADOT since Mark Andrews got hurt. So, Flowers is fine, but at 30% ownership, absolutely a justifiable fade. I think Odell Beckham out of all these Ravens wide receivers is my favorite play overall, which is a bit scary to say given that he's had like 7 ACLs at this point. But he's right there with Zay Flowers in usage. He's cheaper. He has a far more downfield role, nearly twice as many air yards as Zay Flowers. He's been far more efficient on a per route basis. The matchup against the San Francisco defense, pretty much for everyone involved on Baltimore, is pretty tough. But I consider Odell an outright better tournament play. Rashad Bateman, also a decent salary saving option. I'd say, him and Wandale, if you look at like projected value, are probably the top 2 guys sub 4K. But I think I prefer, Bateman and even Richie James to Wandale in these larger field tournaments. I mean, what are we doing with this Wandale ownership? But Rashad Bateman, 82% of Zay Flowers volume since the team lost Mark Andrews, and he's just 60% of Zay Flowers price. So that's the argument there. You could also argue for Nelson Aguilar, which I just won't. Aguilar's ADOT since Andrews went down is just 5.8. His raw usage is pretty terrible, but he is the stone minimum. So if you were making a ton of Lamar Jackson lineups, Aguilar's viable. And then of course, Isaiah Likely has stepped, pretty much right into this Mark Andrews role, run a route on 85% of the team's dropbacks over the last 2 weeks, averaging 6.5 targets per game, 76 receiving yards per game, and 18.7 fantasy points per game over that stretch, all top 8 marks among tight ends. So, he'll be right there with Austin Hooper as the best value tight end. And pretty hard to argue with. It's going to be reflected in ownership. I think the more interesting discussion with Baltimore is sort of what we do with Lamar Jackson. Brock Purdy is going to be the second highest owned quarterback after Jalen Hurts, who will be, pretty clearly the highest owned quarterback. Lamar Jackson falls into a similar category as Patrick Mahomes, where you can poke plenty of holes in him. He's not running a ton in the red zone. This is a very tough matchup against San Francisco. That's been the 7th toughest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing quarterbacks since they traded for Chase Young, but he's also Lamar Jackson. He's a very talented player who's running all the time. This is the most important game of Baltimore's season. Scott, I'm curious if you have any takes on Lamar Jackson in this contest.
I think he's fine. I think he can get there with his legs, although, hasn't really done a ton of that. He did well last week, right? But before that, it was, we saw Gus Edwards and the running back significantly more involved in the red zone to his detriment. Harbaugh spoke on that, said that was, part of their game planning. I don't know. To me, I would just boil it down to Jalen Hurts or Brock Purdy and then call that a day. That's just the way I would want to take it. Where Hurts really stands out to me within his price range, and then Purdy within his. What about the running backs on Baltimore side? Keaton Mitchell went down. Any interest in Gus Edwards, maybe scoring 2 touchdowns, but still not hitting value?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the only argument that you can make for Edwards. Like I said, Lamar's usage in the red zone, especially inside the 10, is almost non-existent, especially lately. That would all be expected to go to Gus Edwards for the most part. At the same time, he's 5,700. So like you said, Scott, I mean, if he runs for 35 yards and scores twice, he still might not win you a tournament, which could be pretty frustrating. But I don't think anyone is really going to get to Justice Hill, who I wouldn't consider in play. I mean, in the Millie, I guess it's fine. But yeah, I don't feel great about Gus Edwards. I guess he's mostly just a fine play to me. I probably like him slightly more than projections imply, but he's the kind of guy that really needs Baltimore to show up in this game. And so I think it could make sense to pair him with the Ravens defense.
And then 49ers side, play all of the Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, Christian McCaffrey, the matchup against Baltimore is pretty tough, but does that really matter when Christian McCaffrey is, a god for fantasy, seeing incredible usage, seeing better red zone usage than any player at any position? He's an incredible play. If you're splitting hairs, I would slightly prefer Isaiah Pacheco as a value, but they're both cash game must plays, both some of the highest projected plays of the slate. Again, like I said at the top of the show, it's McCaffrey, Pacheco, Rashee Rice in that top tier of the guys that are the most likely plays that you're going to need to have to take down a tournament, or probably to win just about anything this week. San Francisco pass game is pretty tough. I'm right there with you. I think, Purdy, clearly the second best quarterback play after Jalen Hurts. I think like Scott said, you could get away with just playing Hurts and Purdy and try to get different elsewhere. I think that's a pretty reasonable strategy. But yeah, Purdy's been playing incredible. This offense is unstoppable. This is also the highest total game of the slate. Baltimore's defense is tough, but whatever, they're playing incredible. And we've seen, as Ryan Heath pointed out, we've seen Kyle Shanahan attempt to stat pad to get his players accolades and achievements. They were feeding Christian McCaffrey at the end of a total blowout game like 8 weeks ago to keep his touchdown streak alive. And I wouldn't be surprised if they drew up more passing plays to try to get Brock Purdy some extra touchdowns so that he could secure MVP in this game. So yeah, Brock Purdy, very strong play, clearly the second best play at quarterback after Jalen Hurts. And then we have these San Francisco pass catchers who, I mean, Scott, I think you said a couple weeks ago, they're all averaging like 12 expected fantasy points per game, and they're all scoring, 25 actual fantasy points per game. To me, Deebo Samuel stands out as the best of the group. I don't believe, he's not projecting as an incredible value looking industry wide. It looks like Ayuk is actually projecting as a slightly better value. And I think you could argue that's a mistake. Debo's been right behind Christian McCaffrey in terms of red zone usage, which is a great sign considering that Christian McCaffrey is the most utilized red zone player in football. Debo has earned 86% as much red zone usage as McCaffrey over the last 4 weeks. George Kittle is the next closest at just 39%. So Debo's touchdown equity here is very, very strong. And Scott, like you laid out in the Everything report, Debo might just be back to being 2021 Debo Samuel, where he's hyper efficient, getting a ton of great usage near the goal line, and is going to massively exceed his touchdown expectation. And yeah, I think it looks like consensus projections are baking in a bit of a, regression for Debo, which makes sense when you see, he's averaging like 14 expected fantasy points per game and is scoring 30 fantasy points per game over his last 4 games or whatever. But man, I mean, it's very easy to see him keeping that up at the same time.
I think the answer is either, Debo for sure, or we have no idea. And it's just, this offense is awesome. And any of these guys can go off any week and seemingly random for the most part. So just mix your exposure. But if you're just a one lineup guy, Debo definitely stands out. Anything else from this game to talk to speak on? Did we miss Kittle?
Yeah, I do really like Kittle, but the matchup is really brutal. I mean, Baltimore's coverage guys, their linebackers, and Kyle Hamilton are really good at defending tight ends. So that would be like the main hole that you could poke in George Kittle, but he's also tied for the position lead in games of 20 or more DraftKings points. He's been hyper efficient since week 10, leading all tight ends in yards per route run. Tournament ownership is going to be highly concentrated on Isaiah Likely and Austin Hooper. So I think you could argue for Kittle as a bit of a contrarian tournament play. Another note that I'll add is that, I mean, all of these, not all of them, but a good portion of these tight ends are projecting as very strong values, especially relative to the sub 5,500 wide receivers. So tight end in the flex, like on any 3-game slate, very viable, probably more viable on this particular slate, given the strength of the position.
All right. So I built a lineup based on your recommendations. You want to hear it?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. Brock Purdy, Isaiah Pacheco, Christian McCaffrey, Rashee Rice, AJ Brown, Richie James could switch to Hyatt. We do have 2 Chiefs already. Austin Hooper, Isaiah Likely, Ravens defense, 200 remaining. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you may have discovered the nuts, Scott. Another 25K lineup.
Wow, look at that.
Is in your future. It's going to be a pretty good Christmas for you.
Wow, that'd be awesome. Yeah. Make it like Hanukkah, just 8 days in a row of 25K hits.
Yeah, it just never stops.
All right. I think that'll do it for us today. If you have any questions for Jake, hit him up in Discord. Not a lot of people are watching this right now, which is understandable. We have a bunch of games coming up today, main slate tomorrow. But you can watch this whenever at fantasypoints.com. And like I said, hit Jake up in Discord if you have any questions. Jake, thank you for coming on. I hope you have a very blessed and Merry Christmas, and to you all at home as well. Thank you for listening.